Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture, Records and Information Management and Archives like Peas and Carrots. So here are our weekly topics for this week. We'll be looking at what is records and information management, what challenges do records managers and archivists face when documenting modern bureaucracies, what are possible solutions to those problems, what is the connection between records management and archives, and what are some possible conflicts between records managers and archivists. And for the purposes of this lecture, we'll be looking at all of our course learning objectives for this course. So 5 out of 5, hooray. We'll start by exploring a little bit of some definitions of what is records management or records and information management. So here we have a quote from the Foscarini article for this week and from the Safferty chapter that you looked. One thing that I want to focus on is this idea of records management as being a meaningful conceptual and physical frame for the active management of an organization's or individual's records. So to me, meaningful means that the picture of an individual or of an organization that can be derived from the records that are gathered and kept during records management is accurate. So the records reflect the actual actions and uses of records that members of an organization or an individual take. There's also a sense of completeness. So the amount of records collected also have to be substantial enough to really document all of the different functions that an individual or an organization are involved with. So accuracy and volume, I think, are two important considerations to make when you are thinking about whether or not a records management system or records management activities really are meaningful, or if they're not meaningful because they're not accurate or they don't cover all of the functions of a person or of an organization. And we'll talk a little bit later on about how the Foscarini article argues in a lot of ways that records management as it is currently done doesn't really create a meaningful framework for the active management of records. Okay, and then we have this quote from the Safferty chapter. He describes records management as a business discipline, which is something that we'll touch on later. There really is concern with a systemic analysis and control of recorded information, and more specifically, information created, received, maintained, or used by an organization pursuant to its mission, operations, and activities. So this is a definition of records management, which really is focused on its role as a part of doing business. So it exists to document the mission, operations, and activities of an organization. It is, as it says on the tin, a business discipline. And we'll talk later on about how that can create some conflicts between records managers and archivists further on down the road. Okay, so to discuss the nature of records management a little bit more, on page 390 of the Foscarini article, the author describes records management as something that is defined by electronic records management systems created by system developers and records managers, and that records managers mediate between software systems that are developed, the standards that they have to adhere to, whether those are legal standards or organizational standards, and the actual users of the records themselves, so people within an organization that will be using the records for whatever purpose. And that really got me thinking about the types of curatorship and archives that we have been discussing. So Just for review, here they are again: creation by the individual traditionally named as the creator, creation by communities to which creators belong, creation by custodians, creation by archivists, and creation by activators. And just in that last slide, we named a few different forces that can create the records that researchers ultimately look at. So we talked about system developers. So they're the ones that design the electronic records management systems that records live in, that attach information to records, that allow records to be used. So that could certainly be a type of creatorship, probably most appropriately attached to this first one, creation by the individual traditionally named as the creator. We talked about standards, and again, that could either be organizational standards for how records are kept or legal standards about how records are kept. So we could attach that to creation by the communities to which creators belong. So a community that an organization is a part of has said, you have to keep these records for this amount of time, or the organization itself has said, we're going to keep these records for a certain amount of time because they have business value for, X number of years. And then we also have creation by custodians, which in a lot of ways can be tied to records managers because they may not be the ones actually creating the records, but they have a role in how the records are maintained over time and how they move through the cycle of being active and then semi-active and then either disposed of or sent to the archive. And so I think that creation by custodians is most appropriate for records managers. So again, just to kind of highlight some different acts of creation that we've talked about before and that I've already touched on when we talk about the nature of records managers and records management. So these creative roles by, again, the system developers, the records managers, really can have a strong influence in the ingredient stage that we talked about. So they really can have a lot of influence in what information and the quality of information that ends up in archives for different processes like arrangement and description, access, reference, and enhanced access as well. So again, just to remind you that the actions that system developers take when they're developing the systems that create and control records, and the decisions that records creators make when they are classifying materials and making sure that records are retained and disposed of appropriately really can have a strong influence in what archivists have to work with, and in turn, what researchers have to look at in the future. So next, we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that records management is primarily concerned with. So as I've touched on before, determining for how long recorded information must be kept, ensuring compliance with laws and regulations. The last thing that an organization wants is for a lawyer or someone to come looking for records that the organization is supposed to keep for X number of years, and lo and behold, those records aren't there, because that can cause a lot of legal problems for organizations that don't hold on to records for as long as they are legally required to do so. Managing inactive records in a cost-effective manner. So again, going back to the idea of records management as a business discipline, and a part of that is cost and making sure that organizations are not spending money on records that they don't need to be spending money on. So whether that means getting rid of records or sending records to a record center, as the Dingwall chapter mentioned, where they're not taking up space within the organization, that is something that records managers are responsible for, and something that records management is really concerned with. The next thing that we'll mention is organizing active records for access when they're needed. So really setting up, again, this framework so that if someone needs to look at a record or needs to access a record for whatever reason, they're able to do that efficiently. And last but not least, protecting recorded information that supports the vital organizational goals. So the last thing that you want is for someone to be able to access information that might be private or that might contain proprietary information that that needs to be protected. So information about products that an organization is developing or information that really has value that shouldn't be in the hands of people that are outside of the organization. As the Dingwall chapter mentions on page 141, records managers really were created to manage modern challenges related to the creation, use, and management of records, which you can kind of tie to all of these things that I just mentioned. And it's really interesting to see some of the echoes between Safedy's description of records management as a business discipline and this list of things that records management is primarily concerned with. So I talked about managing inactive records in a cost-effective manner, protecting that vital proprietary information. A part of managing records in a cost-effective manner is determining how long information must be kept. So how long it really meets the needs of the organization or how long the organization is required to keep those records. And really making sure that people are able to efficiently organize or access records when they are needed so that they don't have to go through a bunch of hurdles to find the information that they're looking for. So really all of these go back to this idea of efficient access to materials that the organization needs to keep around for whatever reason. And also, again, keeping those materials private and secure. Okay, so the activities of records managers are aided and also constrained by record schedules. And so what I have here on my screen are record schedules for the University of Wisconsin system. So these record schedules apply to every university and college in the UW system. And you can see we have a few different features here. So we have a specific number for the record schedule. We have a series title, which provides some general information about what kinds of records are located in or are addressed by this record schedule. And then we have more detailed description of what kinds of records fall under this record schedule as well. Okay, then we have a retention period, which states this is how long records need to be kept. So these records need to be kept for 3 years. A trigger event, so a trigger event is what starts the clock on the retention schedule. So as soon as the meeting minutes for these internal review board meetings are approved, that starts the 3-year clock. And then we have a disposition. So once this 3 years is over, these records are meant to be destroyed, and something saying that these records are confidential. So all of these different rules that records have to follow are going to inform the records manager of what to do with these records. So once these records have passed 3 years, then a records manager would say, okay, we can get rid of these, the retention date is passed, and we're no longer legally required, or we're no longer required by the UW system to keep them. And some retention periods as we'll talk about in just a minute, can be very short. So until superseded, some of them may be just for a little while, and then some of them may also be quite long. So this retention schedule is permanent. So these records will never be destroyed, and they are not confidential. So some of them don't last very long at all, and some records are meant to be kept, until cockroaches rule the world. So 0 days, 0 days, 0 days. So anywhere from permanent to, until something comes out or until something is superseded. And there are a few different reasons why certain information might be kept for a longer period of time than other types of information. Let's go through this real quick. So retention periods and the disposition of records typically depend on the content of the type of record that is being addressed by the record schedule. So records that have continuing business or research value, or records that are legally obligated to be kept for a certain amount of time, are the ones that are going to be retained for the longest amount of time, and ones that are more likely to end up in archives at some point. Records that have little or no business or research value and have no legal obligations attached to them are likely to be destroyed fairly quickly and are unlikely to end up in archives. And in the Dingwall article, he describes disposition and archival appraisal, which we'll talk about next week, as being the same side of different sides of the same coin. So the disposition of the record, so either retention or disposal, will determine what an organization will get rid of, and archival appraisal will determine what archives will take. So again, these retention periods and disposition can range from, a matter of days until it's destroyed, or something that is retained permanently and is scheduled to be transferred to the archive. And again, it just kind of depends on what is actually contained in the record. One unfortunate thing that the Foscarini article mentions is that in a lot of ways, record schedules may not be the best way to make sure that records that document the activities of an organization are maintained. And her article really focuses on how archivists and records managers are not able to accurately document the activities of an organization. So in this quote here, she talks about how records managers and archivists are aware of how complex organizations have gotten, of the deep transformations in society. However, in a lot of ways, they've kind of put their head in the sand and, as Foscarini writes here, tend to forget that the supposed stability of functions and activities is only apparent. The records may reside anywhere, and not just in official record-keeping systems, and the actual work practices are often fairly different from the way in which laws, regulations, and internal manuals of procedures and the people themselves who are in charge of given activities articulate how work gets done. So what she's saying is that if you base record schedules and retention periods and descriptions of records on an understanding of the functions and activities of an organization that aren't really accurate because they're not reflecting how people actually use records and how they actually interact with records. And record schedules don't reflect the fact that records may be kept in places outside of record schedules, then that can really result in a picture of an organization's activities that is not accurate. So FOSS screening really focuses on the chaotic nature of organizations. And again, how archivists and records managers have been unable to grasp how contemporary organizations work. And that's because organizations, at least to a certain extent these days, are human creations and thus they are chaotic. So as we mentioned in the last quote, people may use records in a way that they're not intended, or not keep records in places where a records manager will look for them, or use records that aren't really captured by record schedules. And so because of this chaos, it's really difficult to set up standards or some kind of model, such as a record schedule, that is going to reflect how an organization actually operates. And that can have a lot of impacts on social memory and on how people understand the activities of an organization, 5 or 10 or 15 years down the road. So this may actually be how an organization operates, but the picture of how an organization actually operates that researchers see might be something like this. So what researchers are actually looking at doesn't really correspond with how an organization actually operates, because records managers and archivists haven't really been willing to confront how complex and how chaotic organizations really are. So the FOSS screening article talks about how records managers will just say, well, this is how things are supposed to work, so I'm going to base my record schedules and all my decisions on the premise that this is how the organization is actually operating, when that may not actually be true. So again, this can result in researchers getting a really skewed picture of the operations of an organization and basing their assumptions and perceptions of an organization based on this, this skewed picture. So it's almost like a process where records and information are created and used in a particular way, but records managers think records are actually being used in a way that they're not. So records managers have a false reflection or a false understanding of how records are actually being created and used in an organization. And so what archivists end up getting is an inaccurate information based on the assumptions of records managers. So information that doesn't really actually reflect how records were created and used, because records managers don't really understand what's going on, and thus archivists don't really understand what's going on either. And archivists, by ingesting records that reflect the activities of an organization in a particular way, provide that information to researchers. And so that information is legitimized by the archive. An archive says, by bringing in records and presenting to the public, this is a factual representation of how this organization operated. And so that's what researchers have to work with when they are writing a book or developing a presentation or writing a documentary. So again, if the picture of an organization's activities that a researcher is looking at and using is skewed because of this process where inaccurate information is collected by records managers and passed along to archivists, then that can really result in society interacting with an understanding of an organization that isn't correct. So it can result in a lot of inaccuracies in how people understand how an organization or how a person operated, how they fulfilled different functions, and that can be problematic for a lot of reasons. So next we'll talk about a couple of record-keeping models that have been developed over time in order to at least attempt to retain a meaningful depiction of the activities of an organization. And so we've touched on these a little bit already in class, but since they are related to records management, I wanted to go back and touch on them again. So we'll be talking about the lifecycle model and the record-keeping model. So it's only a model for those of you that enjoy Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Okay, so first we'll start with the lifecycle model. And so this is the pretty linear process that we've talked about in class, in which records have this kind of A to B process where they're created, they're used, they're retained or disposed. What is retained is passed along to archives for the archives to say, yes, we're going to take this, or no, we're not going to take this. And then the records that survive go through accessioning, arrangement, inscription, reference, and access, with preservation or disposal going on all along. And so again, records management is going to take place during these first three phases. So it's really going to influence and be influenced by the creation, by the use of the creator, and records managers are going to be involved in this retention or disposal process as well. So Dingwall is really focused on the lifecycle model as being this description of sequences of activities necessary for a record to fulfill its functions. So again, the records are created for a particular purpose, they're used for a particular purpose, and then once that purpose is served, the records are either retained if they need to be legally or because of standards, or they're disposed of. And as technology progressed, a bulk of records began to be produced. And so the Dingwall article talks about World War I and World War II as being a real catalyst for this. And so this resulted in the creation of record centers to house records that were no longer actively used by organizations, but still might be useful in the future. So records may be retained, but they would be retained sort of offsite in a record center until the retention period for the records had expired, and then the records would either be disposed of or passed along to archivists. And so one of the things that happened from this is it led to an increased distinction between records managers and archivists. So archivists were no longer seen or archives were no longer seen as places for records with possible future use, and instead places for inactive records. So the idea was that archivists would never even interact with records until they were already inactive. And so, as we talked about before, records may be retained for, decades before they are considered inactive and before archivists get to look at them. So this can result in a large gap of time between when the records are retained by the organization that created them and when archivists actually got to interact with the records. So there might be, a gap of decades or even, 5 or 10 years in between when an organization and a records manager said, well, we're not really using these records anymore, but according to the records schedules, we have to keep them. So we're going to put them in a warehouse somewhere and just kind of let them sit there. And then, once that retention period had expired, then we'll give them to the archivist to look at and see what they might want to bring into their repository. Unfortunately, this gap resulted in a lot of problems for archivists, as the Dingwall article touches on. Archivists were losing track of contextual information related to the records, so information about what the record was, who used it, who created it, why it was created, was being lost. And there were some preservation issues as well. You have to think if a record is sitting in a warehouse for, even 10 years, then physical records might start to decay over time if the warehouse maybe doesn't have great climate control, and electronic records may begin to decay as well. Or the format that the record was created on might cause it to decay. So, film might decay. The hard drives that electronic records might be on might decay, and so on. And so there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the lifecycle model among archivists. And so that led to the development of the continuum model, which is something that we touched on last week, and we'll talk a little bit more about today. So as the Dingwall chapter notes, the continuum model was created in response to a dissatisfaction with the difficulty in applying the lifecycle model to complex bureaucracies. So bureaucracies were becoming more complex, and the different functions of bureaucracies were becoming more complex, and it just became really unclear about who was creating what records and how records were being used. And this complexity really made it difficult for archivists to gather enough information about records to appraise, arrange, and describe them. So again, they didn't have this rich contextual knowledge, which really told archivists, this is what this record did, this is who created it, this is how it was used, and so on. Important things to decide, yes, this is a record that we actually want to bring into our repository, or no, this record actually is junk and it didn't really document anything important. So the continuum model is really meant to decrease the gap between when records were determined to be inactive and when archivists would get to look at them. So to reduce the gap between records creation and when archives got a seat at the table to begin appraising the records and learning more about them. So the continuum model really is based on the recognition that records are constantly in the process of being created, and that's something that we talked about last week. Records are constantly in the state of being preserved. So, you always need to preserve records. Records are constantly in the state of being accessed. They're constantly in a state of use. There's not just one sort of finite stage, but rather these stages kind of overlap with each other and continue into the future. So it really represents a more nuanced understanding of what records are and the different processes that records undergo. And again, the idea was that by recognizing that archivists were having difficulty learning about records and what records were used for, archivists really became more aware of the need to work with records creators and work with records managers as soon as possible to make sure that information about the records, usually in the form of metadata, is created and remains attached to the record over time. And what this process does is it really gives archivists more power, as the Dingwall chapter notes on page 156. And it does this by making them less passive recipients of records and gives them more power to shape how records are created and how they are retained and described. So instead of archivists having to wait 10 or 15 years to finally understand what records are and have some say in how records are described and maintained, they're able to do so much sooner. And again, the idea behind that is that in the long run, that's going to make records much easier to preserve and much easier to appraise and arrange and describe because there's going to be more information attached to them, information that's useful both to archivists and to researchers as well. So Dingwall talks about how if the continuum model is taken to extremes, it could even lead to archivists having an impact on which records are created to begin with. So perhaps the archivist would have some role in the development of records management systems, the electronic records management systems that we talked about. So it wouldn't just be the records manager making these decisions, it would be the archivist as well. And that can certainly be beneficial for researchers, as we'll talk about later on in the lecture. So the idea is that archivists will have much more of a role in determining which ingredients survive, so which records survive, and also how good the ingredients are, or which information is attached to records. And again, you want your ingredients to be as tasty as possible. And so if you're an archivist, you want records to have as much information attached to them as you can, because that just makes it easier for you to create your archival meal down the road, which ideally is going to result in an archival collection available to researchers that does have rich contextual knowledge attached to it, and therefore is more useful and more accurate. So again, this large gap in time can be really problematic for archivists. And, that's kind of the approach towards the life cycle of the record that archivists had for a long time. And in a lot of ways, it is the approach to records that archivists still have. So records may be created and, sit in someone's basement or sit in a warehouse for however long. And then once the records are past their retention schedule, then the archivist can get a hold of them. And as I mentioned before, this can result in a lot of information being lost. So the records might actually say Mary had 2 white cats, and then the records manager might misinterpret or misunderstand what the records are actually being used for, and pass that information along to the archivist. So instead of knowing that the records are saying Mary had 2 cats, archivists end up thinking Mary had 2 black dogs. And so here you have the poor researcher saying, oh, Mary had 2 black dogs. That must be, what actually happened and how an organization carried out its processes. So, the game of telephone, right? A person whispers something into someone's ear and it goes down the line. And by the time it gets to the final person, they might have heard a phrase that is completely different from what the phrase originally was. That's a good sort of metaphor for how records management can go if this lifecycle model is adhered to, because again, you might have a huge gap of time between when the records are created and used and when an archivist actually looks at them to understand what that creation and use was for. So, the idea is that you have a record such as this photo that really has this contextual knowledge attached to it. So who, what, where, when, and why. So as an archivist, this is what you want to pass along to your researchers. If you just have the photo, it might be a good photo. You might be able to look at the photo and get some of the information about who, what, where, when, and why, but it's just simply not as useful for researchers. You may not know, when this photo was taken, where it was taken, why the person that took it, which was me, took it, and the other contextual information. So, I guess just having the picture can be perfectly serviceable if the researcher's information need isn't that detailed, but for a researcher that really needs to dig into the details, that really wants to understand what life was like during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is when I took this photo, then they would want this broader field of information. And if this information isn't attached to the record and kept attached to the record, or if it's not even created in the first place, then this is what archivists may well have to contend with, and not this. And so again, the idea of the continuum model is for archivists to work with systems developers and records managers to make sure that this is what survives, and this is what researchers have to work with in the future. So rather than having a situation where false information is being passed on or is being retrieved by records managers and passed on to archivists who then pass on to researchers, you have a situation where records managers are working more closely to understand how records are created and used. So they're working more closely with the people that develop these systems, or with the people within an organization that are actually using the records and saying, hey, how are you using these records? What systems are you actually using? How are you interpreting these standards, and so on? And that archivists are getting more of an idea and having more of an influence on how records are being created and used as well. And that allows them to pass on accurate information and legitimizing accurate information that researchers end up using. So instead of this game of telephone that ends up with researchers using information that isn't an accurate portrayal of an organization or of a person's activities, the picture that researchers have of an organization that they get from an archive and that the archive gets from records managers is more complete and more accurate. However, there are a lot of things that can get in the way of this type of a relationship happening, and it really goes back to the relationship between archivists and records managers. So in a lot of ways, archivists and records managers have contrasting philosophies or contrasting goals. So as the Dingwall chapter mentions, records managers are focused on business efficiency and meeting business needs, and archivists are more focused on serving research interests. And one way that archivists can focus on serving research interests is by making sure that as much information as possible survives for researchers to look at. So the more information a researcher has, the better, right? But because of the role that research managers have in making sure that information, that records that are no longer needed are destroyed, or that particular information is kept confidential, that really goes against this desire among archivists to allow as much information as possible being available into the future. And this is something that the Safety chapter touches on. So the author discusses how people in an organization might create information in a way that doesn't produce official records, which would be tied to record schedules. And so that can impact the information available for archivists. So someone in an organization might say, well, don't write an email because that's a record. And we have to keep that for, the next 20 years. Instead, call someone on the phone, go down to their desk and talk to them, because that's not a record and that's not something that we need to keep for however amount of time. So that's something that records managers might encourage people to do, or organizations might encourage their employees to do if they don't want information to survive in the future, whether it's because they just don't want to pay for having to preserve and maintain records, or if it's something sensitive that they're trying to hide and they don't want any record of it to be available in the future. Another thing is that an organization's records are its property, so they get to decide how and what records are retained, again, within certain legal requirements. So an archivist, especially an archivist from outside of the organization, is going to have very little leverage to say, well, here's what I think you should do with your records, because the records manager or lawyers at the organization might say, oh, well, I can think of a few things that you can do with these records, but bringing them to your archival repository is not one of them. So there's really not a whole lot of leverage for archivists to encourage organizations to engage in more of a continuum model relationship, where archivists have more power and control over how records are created and which information is attached to records. And in fact, if you look at our previous point, there's a lot of disincentive for records managers and organizations to enter into that kind of relationship. There are some overlaps between records management and archiving, and that's something that both the Safety article mentions and the Dingwall article, and we'll talk about some examples from the Foscarini article in just a minute as well. So there is a records management lifecycle, which we touched on, that determines how records are kept and for how long they're kept. And interestingly enough, oftentimes records management functions in nonprofit organizations can be found within the archives department. So typically in a university, the records management operations will be a part of the archive. So even though they may have different goals and different purposes, they may actually be a part of the same department, interestingly enough. So Safety describes records management and archiving as allied professions that, again, have different missions. And the differences in these missions really can result in a lack of a desire for records managers to cooperate with archivists in the archival goal of providing as much information to researchers in the future as possible. So the Foscarini article also mentions some of the overlaps between archivists and records managers. So both professions are really focused on the functions of an organization and what they are. They really are focused on understanding people's motivations and attitudes, technologies and artifacts, and how they influence the operation of an organization. Both professions really are interested in records creation and classification, appraisal and selection. You know, records managers appraise records. In a lot of ways, that's what a retention schedule is. It is a reflection of the perceived value that a record has. So records that are thought to be more valuable are kept for a longer period of time, and records that are thought to be less valuable are gotten rid of sooner. They're both involved with arrangement and description. They're both involved with access and security. They both follow written statements, policies, and procedures. So there really is a lot of overlap between the two professions. But again, the way that they diverge is through what they ultimately want to do with the information that is available to them. So you can see the reflection of records management and how records management has developed over time in our key factors. So looking at our fifth course learning objective, so the changing nature of records, I touched on electronic records and how that has been difficult for records managers to work with and has really resulted in a desire by archivists to have a more continuum approach to make sure that information is attached to electronic records and that electronic records are preserved adequately. An increase in the number of records, that was really what led records managers to be created as a profession in the first place, to handle this huge tidal wave of records that governments were producing. The increasing complexity of subjects. So again, this is something that has influenced records management and has made records management more difficult because there are just more moving parts in an organization and more moving parts in a bureaucracy that records management has to collect records from and make sense of. So just within the field of records management, you know, we have three of our factors that have really pushed records management in one way. And again, what influences records management is going to influence archives down the road because of the more typical role that archives have of just having to wait and see what happens with records before the archive actually has a chance to interact with them. So to look a little more closely at one of our weekly topics for this week, what are some possible conflicts between records managers and archivists? Because records creators and records managers have a lot of influence over which records survive for archivists to collect and provide to researchers, you know, that can lead to some conflict, because it's a situation where one party has a lot of the power and archives are sort of forced to be passive and wait for information to come to them. And so, again, that's something the continuum model is meant to address, but for the most part, this is what the relationship looks like, and not a lot of archives are really happy with that arrangement, and it can be a source of possible conflict. So we talked about how archives and records managers are, for the most part, interested in doing the same thing. So you would think that that would really gloss over some of the conflicts that archivists and records managers have, but again, because of the different goals of the two professions, that really does leave a lot of room for conflict to occur. And there are some ethical considerations as well. So records managers may facilitate the destruction of information that archives feel is important for society, and archivists may feel an ethical obligation to prevent this from happening. So archivists may fear or suspect that an organization is destroying records that may be used to hold it accountable for its actions, and that records managers may play some role in facilitating this destruction. And that's something that archives, with our focus on helping researchers and helping the public, may feel obligated to prevent happening. And so that can be another benefit of the continuum model, is it can help prevent records that can hold organizations accountable for their actions from being destroyed. And a genesis for these conflicts between records managers and archivists is an increasing desire among archivists to document social justice issues and provide records related to them to their researchers. So something that I didn't talk about before was the changing use of records, and that's something that can be an issue here. So as archivists are more focused on using records for social justice purposes and documenting social justice issues in society, there is more of a desire among archivists to get a hold of records that might contain information that can be used to hold organizations accountable for their actions. And so this desire to document social justice issues that organizations might have some involvement with can create conflict as well, because again, you have archivists seeking to help the public and help researchers and hold organizations accountable for their actions. And you have records managers who are employees of organizations who may have a vested interest in making sure that those records never see the light of day. And the organization's lawyers certainly will have a vested interest in making sure those records don't see the light of day. So again, two professions that do have some overlaps, but there's a whole lot of room for conflict. There has been some bad blood historically between records managers and archivists. They were once kind of very closely allied professions, but as time has progressed, that has become less and less true because of some of these conflicts that I just talked about. Generally speaking, archivists approach records managers and records management with a little bit of skepticism, and we know what side records managers are on, and that kind of results in some conflicts between the two professions. So, all right, so that was an overview of what records management is, some of the responsibilities and characteristics of records managers and records management. We looked over retention schedules. We talked about some of the overlaps and differences between records management and archiving, and how those differences might lead to conflicts between the two professions. So we'll talk about records management a little bit more next week when we talk about archival appraisal, because as I mentioned, there's some overlap between the retention judgments that records managers make in appraisal and how records management affects appraisal and the ability of archives to appraise records. So we'll kind of revisit records management next week and provide a little bit more detail about what we discussed this week, but hopefully you know more about records management and how it relates to archives. And if you have any questions, of course, please feel free to shoot me an email and I'll be more than happy to answer them. So thanks for listening and have a great week.